let's go ahead and welcome our next guest. We got Rakshith Rao, co-founder and CEO of APIwiz. Hey, Rakshith.
Hello. Thank you for having us here, Jen.
Thank you. And we're looking forward to learning more about unpacking API lifecycle management. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. API lifecycle management is a fairly extensive topic, and I think so. It does require a day of its own and a track of its own. But today's conversation was more centered towards trying to make sure that we understand the overall evolution of the API lifecycle management. So we want to primarily take a step back, look at where it's come so far, the journey it's taken, so that we can start looking at the challenges that we are facing today and what's required for the next decade to be really successful and having successful API programs. To begin with, wanted to set the context in terms of in today's world where we take things for granted in terms of connected experience, it's always amazing in terms of what the customer expectations are, and it keeps evolving. And some of the things over the years have made it so obvious and taken for granted. The expectation bar keeps going higher and higher. So for enterprises, there's obviously needs in terms of pushing the envelope of innovation and bearing fruits in terms of what's the next that they can actually offer back to their customers. So in in all reality, an API first architecture has really helped enterprises unlock the core value of their enterprises over the years. And given the state in which the data has been primarily made available in all forms and shapes, because the value is only as useful as its consumption. And given the context of how it was locked up in the core firewalls of an enterprise to where it is today, where there is a zero trust zone in which enterprises operate today, there is no more internal and external because they're trying to make sure that everything can be made easily accessible as long as you have controlled access to those through an API. And which is where it comes to the part of how these APIs, which really are helping enterprises drive more value and deliver better customer experience, managing these APIs becomes super important. And this is something which has really shaped over the last decade. And by no means I can define it the right way, and there's no right or wrong. If you ask practitioners and product teams and the end users, you could find various flavors of what an API lifecycle management really is. But one thing which is very clear is APIs have now transformed from just being a technical asset within the organization, which is now providing access to core data assets, to becoming more like a product. And like any product, it has a life cycle. And making sure that you obviously are going through the life cycle and making them available in forms and shapes available to both internal and external audience becomes super important. And the if you look at the journey of the API lifecycle management or an API management itself, back in the days of when the mobile applications really came out, it was always about, hey, can I get these mobile apps? You consume my APIs. Oh, by the way, it was always built in SOAP. Let's make sure that we make them available in new form factors like REST, JSON, and other formats that are actually usable for omni-channel experience. So a gateway became a super important part, which acted as the facade, which made sure that you obviously could control what's coming in and what's going out, provided the safety net, throttling, security, mediation, transformation. So a gateway was an important aspect to begin with. And obviously, you started realizing that it's the APIs need to be consumed both internally and externally. So having a developer portal is super important. And last but not the least was, hey, do we really have visibility? Do we really understand who's consuming to what extent? That shaped the journey of an API management over the years. Because what obviously started out as a layer in between existing complex monolithical applications, but making available newer consumable services to mobile applications and IoT devices was the norm of the day. Slowly over the years, we started realizing that the it had to really expand beyond the core constructs of what it was to make sure that there was a level of API growth or the demand really increased because of the value they brought back into the enterprise. So businesses started seeing them as products. So as products need to be really tested and made sure they are well trained for both folks internally and externally to use them and to draw a monetary benefit from those, because that's when a lot of enterprises started tapping into the monetary value of the data that was being exposed as APIs. And they were able to experiment things out. They were able to try and see what actually worked and what could actually be changed. And this needed the ability for the APIs to be released a lot sooner, quicker, and faster. And this brought in a new requirements for both API consumers and API providers. And one key aspect to keep in mind was enterprises were no more just providing or exposing services outside their corporate firewall. They started realizing that it's also more beneficial to consume services which were prepackaged or made available through other enterprises out there so that they could actually get to market a lot quicker and faster. This this essentially meant the current state we are actually in today. So the future of all the applications and APIs have slightly changed from what it was before because the APIs, which were well controlled, well structured, operated within the corporate firewalls, now need to be deployed in multiple locations. And obviously, the cloud migration started happening a couple of years back, and it became mainstream. And now obviously, it's just not about having a public cloud strategy, it's also about a multi-cloud strategy. And along the line came about great, which can actually now leverage some of the cloud-based deployment models and ability for us to now look at using the cloud providers, hosted functions and others, which made it even more easier. And if the strategy was not ready, building newer lightweight microservices like all the various other participants in the track have spoken earlier on, the benefits that microservices bring to the table is no more debatable. It's just a matter of timing and the strategy in terms of how are you going to change from your existing monolithic applications to microservices is the way forward. But what does this really mean to an API lifecycle management? Because the complexity slightly now goes beyond the realm of what it was. Because of the way how we migrated from saying on premise to the cloud, you obviously have a choice of cloud providers and and also the microservices and the service mesh that you need to operate with. And API gateway versus service mesh, that's a topic that I don't want to touch on this specific conversation, but there is no one right or wrong strategy. It's either combinational or you slowly use one for internal, one for external, or for depending on where it's being built. So every organization has a well-written strategy specifically to microservices and service mesh. So all said and done, there needs to be an ecosystem that the newer API lifecycle management now starts to now think about in terms of the operating environments, as well as the kinds of APIs and the protocols that we need to start supporting. Over the years, GraphQL, gRPC, the ASIC initiatives have really taken more shape and wings beyond what it was before. So it needs to be a combinational hybrid model in which some of the newer services that are going to be built need to be managed. And the other part of this is the overall lifecycle management itself has now got to a state where the process of taking something from a key business initiative and translating that to a service that is consumable and making sure that it is treated as a product that can be iterated, version managed, released successfully with high reliability, and manage the release cycles has become super important. And given this importance, there is no one single provider out there that can actually offer an end-to-end solution. And this has opened up the room for enterprises to choose, uh, pick and choose the best of the breed of what's available out there, or either choose open source or handcraft them on their own. What this leads to is over a period of time, when you're building a handful of APIs to when it gets to hundreds of APIs to when it gets to thousands of APIs, all of this will not work at the same rate what it was applicable before. It's inhumane to have a visibility across multiple BUs or uh, units with business units within the organization. An organization that we were dealing recently had over 45,000 services which were being consumed by around 5,000 odd applications, both internal and external. Having a matrix of which application is consuming which service, where it exists, what's happening with those, what's the impact of making a subtle change into an API is something that's become super important. And existing way of operating does not really lend well into where it's actually going. So some of the impedance that we really see is specifically the complex deployments that we are seeing and the reliability factor that is actually suffering because of the various aspects of the tool chain that we have actually started consuming. Last but not the least is the amount of time that is being spent on innovation. While every organization is trying to focus on newer innovation and customer experience and working with external partners or developers, while that's a focus, a fair chunk of time is actually being spent on trying to debug dependencies, broken releases, and trying to figure out where the gaps. These are times well not spent on innovation. So preferring where a lot of enterprises are moving towards is having a single unified platform for the next generation, which essentially tries to meet key aspects of making the process of going from design to deprecation a lot simpler and easier. Because what you want is the ability to meet new requirements and business requirements, along with leveraging entire organization to meet those challenges. While it's all being done, you want to have a major check on the governance aspect as well, because it's not about having a centralized governance team or a decentralized enforcement. It's all about trying to make sure that there is best practices, security, and standards that can be enforced uniformly across the organization. And when you try to double click into why it's being looked at, this obviously has improved productivity for the developers. It improves the overall reliability of the services being consumed by partners or by applications internally and externally. There is a level of consistency that you can bring in, which makes sure that end of the day, whether it is being built by 20 different teams, it still portrays and looks like one single organization. last but not the least, you really don't want to go about building the same set of services across various teams when it can be reused and built and used by a single centralized team, which is where an organization which I'm part of, APIwiz, has focused heavily on trying to bring in a simplification in trying to bring in the complete API lifecycle management under one single platform so that it can still work with multiple gateways and service mesh, which enterprises have invested or planning to invest. But it's not about just taking everything that's available out there and put them under one single platform. It's also about trying to take a newer approach, which tries to make it more easier and having a low code approach in trying to take the best practices and seamlessly enforce them behind the scene tries to reduce the overall time to market anywhere between 40 to 60%. This approach has really played very well in trying to make the development to deployment and managing testing, virtualization, documentation, all under one single roof. The idea is to make sure that developers, architects, security team, DevOps team, a business team have a single pane of glass to work with so that the KPIs are aligned. What you are planning and designing is something that is taken all the way into development and production. And these are monitored well even after that. And what we do is not just build them in vacuum, but also make sure that there are hooks and connectors that actually blend well into each of the deployments and technologies that enterprises may have today so that they don't need to switch between various tools and technologies and gives them the obvious benefit of trying to abstract out the complexity so that it gives them room for choosing what's right for the organization in their transformation journey, whether it's on premise or on cloud or a runtime of their choice or a service mesh of their choice or where they want to run on. Because what you're really focusing on is to bring in a level of consistency. This is where the APIwiz platform really helps meet some of the core challenges that enterprises are going to face over the next decade. And where we see this really coming together is in a form where a hybrid deployment is made flexible, and SaaS is something that's taken for granted to start with, and choose to move between the various deployment models, all in supporting the ever growing API changes, whether it is SOAP, REST, or even GraphQL or gRPC as it progresses on. Why should the best practices or the runtime choice differ the overall best practices? Which is where the abstraction capability of APIwiz platform is trying to focus on, and that needs to be a generic API lifecycle management capability that needs to be made obviously available so that enterprises are not locked into a cloud provider or an on-premise provider or a private cloud provider or a technology provider that hinders them from making the switch any given point in time. This has seen huge productivity gains where a lot of enterprises are now able to move between technologies and get to a point where they're able to derive both productivity gains as well as reduction in the cost of running the API program. Because as the number of APIs grow, the cost of running the API program should not. It needs to either remain same or come down so that there is better return of cost for enterprises in the long run. So that brings me to pretty much the end of the this conversation that we had for today. I'm happy to take any questions that people may have. I'm not seeing the chat window, but Jen, I'll
I
let
got
you guide me if there are any.
Yes, Roxy, thank you for talking to us because I think the unpacking the future of the next decade of what the life cycle management is going to look like is a very complex idea to think through for us to prepare for the future, especially in so many roles that go into life cycle management. I would say, what is your take on governments and what's going to be the impact of the new hybrid world?
Great. So governance is a complex topic by itself, and governance can play into multiple levels. It could be a design level governance, it could be a runtime level governance, or it could be more of a product and a design level productization governance. So what we are seeing as a long-term thought that people need to keep in mind is the enforcement and centralized definition is something that they need to keep in mind because governance should not be a barrier for progress or innovation within the enterprise. And it should completely abstract out the hybrid world that we are going to be living in. It's not just the technology which is hybrid. People are also hybrid now. We are all operating in environments where a lot of folks are working remote, outside the offices, consuming services and applications. So having a zero trust model is very important in the new world. And having a governance which can seamlessly enforce across both the API provider side and the API consumer side is super important in the long run.
Thank you for that. And I would say one other question that is a bit basic, yet I think this is a great way to think about it is when we have governance changes that we want to change things down the road that can is not something that we can always think of when we're creating the plan for rolling out our API lifecycle. Do you have any best practices for companies to use? Especially, I can see it being a bit easier when it's a smaller company. Yet, when we have large companies, like when Mike was talking about Netflix or Spotify, you have a gazillion teams to be able to make one small change. Do you have any best practices that you could see us changing in the future?
Obviously, this is a very big thing to keep in mind, Jen. Thanks for bringing that up. What we are seeing of late is you start with a two-pizza team and you primarily get stuff rolling out with a handful of APIs. It's all great and people have it on top of their mind and it's very easy. But as you pointed out, you take a large financial organization, the number of groups and BUs and LOBs within the organization, which are now becoming more domain units, are being completely responsible for both their P&L and their progress and the services that they bring to the table. So, which means now having a centralized team that can define the best practices and having a decentralized enforcement where people do not need to focus on some of the governance aspects is the new way of doing things. Because what happens is the moment you decouple the governance aspect and allow developers to focus purely on the innovation side, the changes, the policy definition, the best practices, and the enforcement have to be seamlessly done behind the scene through a low code, no code approach. And that's the only way of ever surviving in the new world where we are going to have an exponential growth of services and APIs and the teams actually building and consuming them because there is no single way of doing it humanely using best practices that are written across in the documentation and stuck up in the corporate drive.
Yes. And thank you for that, Rakshith. And thank you for joining us today at Interface. It has been a pleasure hearing more about it and definitely learning a bit more about governance with our Q&A. And we look forward to having you at another conference in the future.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.